It's time once again for When Gen X Ruled the Multiplex, where I take a look at the films that shaped the MTV generation. Though in today's case, I'm afraid it's more like the films that shaped little Morgan Richter of Spokane, Washington, because I doubt too many of you will count today's film as having been vital to your personal development, which is a crying shame. Tuff Turf was directed by Fritz Kirsch, known for directing Children of the Corn, and was written by Jet Rink from a story idea by Greg Collins O'Neill and Murray Michaels. Jet Rink is the name of James Dean's character in Giant. It's also the nom de plume of a screenwriter named Ina May. Her screenplay for Tuff Turf was rejected when she first submitted it under her own name, so using the advice of her mother, she switched to a more masculine name and resubmitted it to the same production company, and this time they bought it. Tuff Turf was produced and distributed by Roger Corman's New World Pictures, well known in the 1970s and 1980s for making B-movies. Tuff Turf is a B-movie in the sense that we use the term today. It's a low-budget film with sensationalistic elements that's not meant to be artistic or experimental. It's just intended to entertain audiences and generate a decent return on a small investment. This is not to say B-movies can't have artistic merit. Many do, but Tuff Turf is not in that category. I will say, however, that it is a well-made B-movie with a solid script and solid performances, and it also provides a deliriously entertaining viewing experience. It opens with someone riding a bicycle down a dark and rainy Los Angeles street in a sequence scored to Love Hates, which was performed by Marianne Faithfull and written by Tuff Turf's music supervisor, Jonathan Elias. I own the Tuff Turf soundtrack on vinyl, and it's a good one, and a lot of that is due to Elias. Along with composing music for films, Elias has worked extensively in advertising. He's responsible for the Yahoo Yodel, and more importantly, MTV's iconic moon landing theme. He has also produced albums for artists like Duran Duran, Grace Jones, Yes, and Robert Downey Jr. A while ago, I'd managed to talk a friend into watching Tuff Turf with me, and he was convinced, with reason, that it was going to absolutely suck. And then just within the first couple of minutes of this opening sequence, he said, okay, this is going to be fine. It's a stylishly filmed sequence, and Love Hates, which is an impassioned and ominous song, sets exactly the right tone. You know straight away, this film isn't going to be a disaster. We cut to what is supposed to be a tough, gang-ridden neighborhood, but is actually pleasant, peaceful Reseda. The 1984 Olympics were taking place during filming, and thus the production couldn't shoot in much of greater Los Angeles, which is why a lot of this film will take place in the San Fernando Valley or Culver City. A middle-aged man waits at a bus stop and ogles a pretty teenage girl. The girl is Frankie, who is played by Kim Richards. Richards was a popular child actor. She starred in the 1970s sitcom Nanny and the Professor and appeared in a lot of kid-focused films like Escape to Witch Mountain, but she never managed the transition to adult roles. Her film career pretty much ended with Tuff Turf. Nowadays, she's mostly known for being one of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills and for being Paris Hilton's aunt. Her adult life has been plagued with assorted personal and legal troubles, but none of that takes away from how likable and endearing she is in this role. A vicious street gang hangs out at the newsstand across the street from the bus stop. The gang is led by a hoodlum named Nick, who never does figure out how shirt buttons work. Nick is played by Paul Moniz. Prior to Tuff Turf, Moniz starred with Patrick Swayze and Tracy Scoggins in a short-lived 1982 ABC series called Renegades, in which they play gang members turned undercover cops. I've never seen Renegades, and indeed didn't know it existed until I started researching Moniz's career. But Some Kind Soul uploaded a fuzzy, grainy opening credits sequence to YouTube, and having watched that, I feel pretty confident in saying that Renegades is the greatest TV series ever made. After Tuff Turf, Moniz switched from acting to writing and directing. He's written the screenplays for a handful of films, including 1997's Double Team, which starred Jean-Claude Van Damme and Dennis Rodman. Nick is Frankie's boyfriend, and Frankie is in the process of setting up the middle-aged man for a mugging. She's helped out by her best friend Ronnie, played by Repo Man's Olivia Barash, along with fellow gang members Eddie, played by Michael Wiley, who had small roles in Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Valley Girl, and Mickey, played by Panchito Gomez, who got his start at a very early age playing wee little Antonio on the very early seasons of Sesame Street. Wiley is now a yoga teacher in Mexico City, while Gomez is still working steadily, appearing in films like Panero and American Me. In 1994, he appeared in the film Saints and Sinners, which was written and directed by his Tuff Turf co-star, Paul Moniz. The mugging is disrupted by the cyclist cyclist from the opening scene who rides his bike straight into the thick of things, delivering strategic sidekicks and giving the mugging victim a chance to get away. The cyclist is a high school student named Morgan Hiller, played by James Spader, who'd already appeared in a good handful of films by this point. He'd go on to have a much higher profile in the second half of the 80s, with big roles in films like Pretty in Pink and Sex, Lies, and Videotape, for which he won Best Actor at the Cannes Film Festival. Morgan is the new kid in town. His family just moved to Los Angeles from Connecticut, where Morgan had been kicked out of multiple prep schools for his rebellious behavior. He shows up for his first day at his tough, gang-riddled high school in a montage set to the song Tuff Turf by New Jersey rocker Southside Johnny. Frankie, Nick, and the rest of the gang spot him and immediately begin plotting their revenge. Morgan makes a new best friend, Jimmy, in an adorably stupid meet-cute in which Jimmy somehow accidentally pulls a switchblade on Morgan in the middle of class. Jimmy is played by future superstar Robert Downey Jr. in one of his earliest screen appearances. Spader and Downey would go on to make two other films together, 1987's Less Than Zero and 2015's Avengers: Age of Ultron, in which Spader played Ultron to Downey's Iron Man. After school, Nick and Frankie destroy Morgan's bike to get even with him for disrupting the mugging. Back at home, Morgan is bawled out by his perpetually disappointed mother, played by theater star Claudette Nevins. Morgan has a more positive relationship with his father, who's played by Matt Clark, who had a long career in westerns but is probably best known to Gen X audiences as the Secretary of Defense in The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. Morgan's dad lost his white-collar job in Connecticut and was forced to move his family across the country to Los Angeles, where he's now working the night shift as a cab driver, which explains why he's wearing pajamas in the middle of the day. That's a surprising amount of somewhat bewildering information to learn about a bunch of characters in a B movie. One thing I appreciate about Tuff Turf is how hard it tries. Often in B movies, your characters will not even have last names or any identifiable personality traits, whereas in Tuff Turf, we just get this constant fire hose of information about the characters. Morgan randomly steals somebody's Porsche and drives to a club at a warehouse where Jimmy is playing the drums for the Jim Carroll Band. Jim Carroll is the late author/poet/punk musician whose memoir, The Basketball Diaries, was turned into a 1995 film in which Jim Carroll was played by Leonardo DiCaprio. At the club, Carroll performs two of his songs, Voices and It's Too Late, both of which are excellent. Frankie arrives at the club with Ronnie and their friend Feather, who is played by Katya Sassoon, daughter of the hairstylist to the stars Vidal Sassoon. Katya died in 2002 of a heart attack. Her sister Eden was on a season of The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills with Kim Richards. Morgan and Frankie end up dancing together, and there are crazy sparks between them. Another reason Tuff Turf works to the extent it does is that there is preposterous chemistry between the leads. Nick arrives at the club with Mickey and Eddie and spots Morgan dancing with his girlfriend. He beats Morgan up and steals the stolen Porsche, whereupon Nick, Mickey, and Eddie all get arrested for driving a stolen car. We meet Morgan's awful older brother Brian, played by Bill Byers, who thinks Morgan is an irredeemable screw-up and who is his mother's clear favorite. Morgan goes for a walk and ends up being chased by Nick. Only it turns out to be Jimmy, who is driving Nick's car while Nick is in jail because Nick's older brother is in the same gang as Jimmy's older brother, which kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about these characters having unusually complicated backstories. Morgan and Jimmy cruise around LA in Nick's car while Breaking the Rules by new wave singer Lena Lovitch plays. They spot Frankie, Ronnie, and Feather dining at a burger joint, and the next thing you know, Morgan, Jimmy, Frankie, and Ronnie are all going for a joyride in Nick's car. They crash a country club in Beverly Hills to load up on lobster and caviar in a surprisingly entertaining sequence in which they all cause as much delightful chaos as possible. There's a lot going on here, but probably the best part is how Ronnie entrances an ever-growing gaggle of country club debutantes with her tips on oral sex. And then the film comes crashing to a halt when Morgan decides to sing a romantic ballad to Frankie. The song he sings is We Walk the Night by Jonathan Elias, and no, that's not Spader singing. He's lip-syncing to vocals by Paul Carney. It's not a bad song, but it's a moment that's so painfully hard-on-your-sleeve earnest that I feel an acute sense of secondhand embarrassment whenever I watch it. After getting booted out of the country club, Morgan and Frankie have a heartfelt chat about their plans after high school and how Frankie misses her dead mother, because, like I said, this film gives us so much backstory on these characters. They drift off to a nightclub where long-standing funk band Jack Mack and the Heart Attack are playing. Frankie starts dancing on tables and doing cartwheels on the dance floor, and the entire crowd looks entranced when they probably should be wondering how these show-offy high school kids got past the front door. Afterward, Nick yells at Frankie for spending the evening hanging around with his arch-nemesis in a scene that's mostly notable for the way it ends. After reconciling with Frankie, Nick drops her on the bed and she says she's not in the mood for sex. It happens off-screen, but it's clear from the staging that Nick responds by performing oral sex on Frankie, which is not something you generally see in 80s teen films. Nick, Mickey, and Eddie then then dole out a shirtless and oiled down and extremely homoerotic locker room beating to Morgan, and then warn him to stay away from Frankie. Undaunted, Morgan promptly climbs through Frankie's bedroom window and invites her to dinner with his parents. Frankie accepts, and after Morgan leaves, Frankie's dad bursts into her room, accompanied by a champagne-swilling Nick, and tells her that Nick has asked for her hand in marriage. Even though Frankie has, for some damn fool reason, agreed to marry Nick, she goes to dinner at Morgan's house, and it's awkward. She feels like Morgan's parents are silently judging her, and while everyone is perfectly polite and friendly, she's not wrong. They're judging her on her table manners and conversational skills, and Morgan isn't helping her, and it makes her miserable. She overreacts to a well-intentioned comment from Morgan's mother about her dead mom, and she storms out after telling Morgan she doesn't belong in his world. Nick, Eddie, and Mickey pick her up, and they cruise around while Jim Carroll's People Who Died blasts from the car stereo. After driving all night, they spot Morgan's father. Realizing her boyfriend is up to no good, Frankie tries to warn Morgan's dad, but Nick, Mickey, and Eddie jump him, and after a scuffle, Nick ends up shooting him in the chest. Morgan visits his dad in the hospital and has a moment of reconciliation with his mother, which is ruined when Big Brother Brian shows up. Morgan takes a battered and unhappy Frankie back to his house and bandages her wounds, and they end up sleeping together. Frankie tells her dad she doesn't want to marry Nick. Nick bursts in, enraged, and calls Morgan and tells him to come to the warehouse club for a big showdown. The climactic showdown takes up a big chunk of the film, and it's pretty rip-roaring. Tuff Turf is not the kind of film to win awards, but it actually won Best Fight Choreography at the 1986 Stuntman Awards. And yeah, the stunt work and the fight choreography is 100% on point. Morgan sneaks into the warehouse like a ninja and silently takes down Nick's henchmen one by one before finally tangling with Nick. At one point, Jimmy arrives with a pair of Dobermans. Nick shoots Jimmy in the leg, but the Dobermans take out Mickey and Eddie. Nick and Morgan have a full-on brawl with all kinds of twists and turns until they end up just wailing on each other with nail-studded boards and fire axes until Nick eventually falls to his presumed death over a railing. The film ends with Morgan, Frankie, Jimmy, and Ronnie all hitting the club to bop around to Jack Mack and the Heart Attack. There is nothing complicated about Tuff Turf. The story's pretty thin, but not in a bad way. The film's almost 2 hours long, and it goes by pretty swiftly. There are no weighty themes that we should ponder. Unlike films like Repo Man or Brazil, it doesn't have the power to make you think about your world in a new way. It just provides simple, uncomplicated entertainment, and it does that pretty well. I never saw Tuff Turf in a theater. My older sister had the paperback tie-in book, which I read and loved. We didn't have cable or a VCR, and so in the 80s, if you missed a film during its theatrical run, there were very few opportunities to see it. And thus, we absolutely loved these paperback tie-ins, which were a way to recreate at least some of the film-going experience at home. Finally, a year or two after its release, I had a chance to see Tuff Turf on cable at a friend's house, and it was everything I could have dreamed of. Tuff Turf is pretty much peak 80s. It combines an iconically 80s depiction of preppies, where Morgan's home life is all Perrier and white cable knit sweaters and conversations about the yacht club, with an equally iconically 80s depiction of gang culture. Nick and his gang could have danced their way straight out of Michael Jackson's Beat It video. Nothing in the story is particularly novel. Having the new kid in town run into trouble with the locals while falling in love with his arch-rival's girlfriend is well-trod ground in 80s films. Look no further than 1984's Karate Kid for an especially well-executed take on this motif. Tuff Turf is flashier and trashier than the Karate Kid, but the story still works because the script is solid enough and the performances are strong enough to sell it. The central romance involves plausible hurdles that the young lovers must overcome throughout the course of the film, and this relationship makes sense to us. We can see that Morgan and Frankie would be better together than apart. Nick is an abusive and borderline psychotic jerk, but his character also makes sense to us. We can see that he loves Frankie in his way, and that he'd go to crazy extremes to eliminate his rival and hang on to her. Tuff Turf instilled in me an early love of well-made and stylish trash. 35 years on, I remain steadfast in my belief that Tuff Turf is a trash masterpiece. It does need a better title, though. That title is just plain stupid. In Germany, Tuff Turf is known as Love Fighters, which is marginally better, so maybe that's what we should all call it from here on out. Next time, I'm leaving behind the uncomplicated pleasures of Love Fighters in favor of the heroin-seeking aliens who infiltrate 1982 New York in the trippy sci-fi cult classic Liquid Sky. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you back here then.